Tips for a successful end to the school year.
Welcome. I'm Doug Smith with Kentucky Valley Educational Cooperative with the Special Ed Department. And today we have with us Miss Kim Howard. She's going to be talking to us about tips to end the school year with the low incidence autism community. And so enjoy the afternoon. And thank you, Miss Kim, for being with us and for presenting for us today.
Thank you all for having me. Tips and tricks for a successful end of the school year. I will tell you, my first few years of school, first few years in the classroom, I didn't realize how many schedule disruptions and how many things changed at the end of the year. They suddenly took away my assistants to, do testing, or I had students that ended up in my classroom that were primarily, they would spend most of their day out in the regular education classroom, but during testing window, they came back to me for part of the day, or they just needed a place to have a break. So I will say, for me, one of the biggest things that I learned was keep your schedule and your classroom routines in place as long as possible. Even if you can only do that partially, try to keep those schedules and routines in place for your students as long as possible, because it's hard on everyone. The more disruptive your schedule is, the more stress level, especially for your students with autism, the anxiety level will rise for them. And it makes it very hard for them to be successful when they don't know what's happening and what's coming. So I try to do a lot of preparation for that end of the school year by some social stories that say, hey, it's this week is testing, and during the testing window, our schedules may change unexpectedly. Don't worry, if that happens, we'll still get everything done and it will be okay. But just kind of a fair warning for my students that it's the end of the school year and a lot of our schedule becomes much more out of our control. They may take classroom assistants, or lunch times may change, or recess windows may change. Lots of different things can happen. That being said, even if you can't keep the whole day's schedule in place, keeping the parts that you can will help. It will definitely help your students. The other thing that you might want to think about at this time of the year is review your classroom expectations. I don't know if you want to call those rules, or it could be behavior expectations. What are the behavior expectations during an assembly? What are the expectations on the playground? Behavior expectations. A lot of times with my students, I taught behavior rules in the form of what's expected in this location and what's unexpected. So on the playground, you might be able to scream. Screaming on the playground could be okay, but pushing our friends is not one of the normal. That's definitely not an okay expectation, right? That's something that would be unexpected and could cause problems. So reviewing your classroom expectations and review your routines. How do we line up? How do we come in from the playground? How do we attend an assembly, or how do we leave the classroom if they're going out to other classrooms, if you have students who are moving from place to place? This is a good thing to do this time of the year. I think sometimes we think we've done it all year. We've taught these expectations all year. The kids should know them. But a lot of times there's so much turmoil and so much turnover of activities and new changes in the routine that it's easy for students to not remember or to forget. What are the expectations in the library? What are my behavior expectations in the library? What are my behavior expectations in the cafeteria? It's a good time to go over those. Spend a few minutes and think about those. It's another really good place to do this time of the year. The other thing that you might think about is updating your assessments. So if you're in a classroom and you give out different assessments towards the end of the year, maybe this is the time of the year, obviously this is the time of the year where you are going over with students to see what have they learned and to help you. I know the hardest thing for me was when I came back in August, a lot of my students' IEPs would be due right at the start of the school year, which is useful on one hand, because then we start the school year with fresh goals and fresh like IEP goals and fresh different our target, like what our target is going to be for that school year. But the hard part was, oh my goodness, it's the start of the school year. So now I need present levels of performance, and I need some of that kind of information. So this is a good time to update those, do those assessments. And this is a good place to think about if you have students that you are considering for summer school needs, or students that will want extended school year services. If you're doing your assessments at the end of the school year, right, you're giving those end of the year assessments. And in my classroom, for some of my students, we were doing things, I'm trying to remember some of the assessments that I did. Some of it was basic skill levels. When I taught elementary age, it was, what letters of the alphabet do you know? What shapes do you know? What parts of your name can you write? Which words, what sight words do you read, or whatever your reading word list are, what functional sight words do you read? Then it will give you information at the start of the school year if you have students that you need to consider for extended year services. You'll have an endpoint. So here's where they left the school year at. Here's at the beginning of the next school year. Then you can take an assessment, your data point then. And then you can see how long does it take them to recoup the skill loss over this from the summer. I know that was something that I didn't consider doing for a few years. And I did some assessment data, but it wasn't, I went into much more formal. So I started looking at, I really needed some good information. And so I pulled that during this season because everybody's schedule was messed up. And so I started putting short bursts of assessment with my students into their routine during this time of the year. So other things that you can think about is what resources can you share with families? So summer resources. So maybe there is summer camp at your school. Maybe you're having extended school year services that are open to all students. Maybe you know about our local hospital. So I live near Moorhead. So I know our local hospital in the summer here offers, for years, they offered feeding therapy in the summer. And that was something that didn't happen all year round. And it was something that some of my families, for students that were autistic and had other low incidence disabilities, very much appreciated that information. So seek out in your area and find out what is available. What's available in your area that families have access to. So maybe it's therapies like feeding therapy or some other sort of things that happen in the summer that don't always happen year round that can be inclusive. The other cool thing is there are lists of summer camps for students with disabilities. I don't know if you've seen some of those. They are not, unfortunately, in the Quebec region or anywhere on this end of the state, basically, but there are some very nice family camps that happen around the Louisville and the Lexington area that entire families can sign up and go to camp. Those are pretty cool and pretty nice to know about. Not all families will want to take advantage of that or be able to take advantage of that, but sometimes we do get families that are like, what's out there for my kids? What else can we do during the summer? Another good thing to think about at this point is I always try to send, even if my students were not going to participate in extended school year services. So in my school district, the last one that I was in the summer, you could come back for typically occupational therapy. You could come back for speech therapy. Some students came back and worked on academic goals. It just depended upon what their extended school year services looked like. But I tried to send to all of my families, especially my families that had students that used an augmentative or alternative communication system. That was one of the hardest things that I found out after the first few years was that many of my students, we worked on PECs. We did picture exchange communication system, and my students were pretty skilled at it. Some of them were. So by that, I mean, they had over 200 pictures that they could request and make commenting. They were doing a lot of things. And so I really wanted them to continue that. I needed them to continue that at home. So what I did do was a couple of times throughout the year, and especially targeting that end of the school year time, I would have a conversation with families and say, hey, Billy is doing so great with using these pictures to communicate. How could I help you set up this system at home? Can I send you copies of the pictures? Do you have time that we could talk? Now we could talk via Zoom, maybe, right? Do you have time that I could do a 30-minute lesson on here's how these work? Here's how you could use this at home. What can I do to support you in carrying over this communication system? And then I also thought about other skills. So life skills and social skills are great things for families to work on in the summer. And I know a lot of times when I suggest this, the response that I get is my families aren't in a place to where they can support that right now. And that's okay, right? Not all families are. I always just sent the information home with everyone and on a best faith effort, right? I sent it home with everyone because maybe mom and dad can't work on this right now, but maybe grandma, and that's who's going to have them the whole summer. Maybe they can work on this, and this is something that they would be able to use. So having conversations with families about things like that, I usually try to recommend fun things. So one year I had a student who had worked really hard, and his family was so excited that he had learned to write his name, and it was a really big deal. And so I suggested to his family that they give him, that he needed to write his name over the summer, but I didn't want to send home a worksheet for him to write his name on every day, right? That's boring, and it's not wrong, but it wasn't going to work for this family. So what we did do was I said, hey, they lived on a dirt road. And I said, why don't you have him write his name with a stick in the mud? That doesn't seem quite like work. The kid enjoyed playing in the mud, and it kept him occupied. And so what we did do was laminate his name. He was still in the place to where he needed to be able to see his name and copy it. He couldn't do it independently, write it yet. And so we laminated a sheet. I think we actually did a couple of sheets just in case they lost one. And so he could drag that outside and he could practice writing his name in the mud. And we gave him some Play-Doh, and he made the letters of his name with out of the shaped it out of Play-Doh. So we did some stuff like that. So it wasn't worksheet based necessarily. And that's not wrong if you have families who want that and students who can tolerate that and will do okay with that. But a lot of times for my students, we had to kind of think outside of the box. Other skills, life skills, are always phenomenal to work on in the summer. Keep brushing those teeth, keep encouraging as independent as possible. A lot of times this involves a collaborative partnership with families, talking with them and seeing what's one or two things that they might have time to work on in the summer. And maybe they'll say, you know what, we can't do anything this summer. And you just have to accept that and be okay with that. But it doesn't hurt to try. And some families will take off with that and be super excited, and some won't be in a place to where they can do that. And that's okay. I came to a point over time to where I was like, okay, I don't have any control in that situation. And sometimes families have a lot on them, just like sometimes schools and teachers have a lot on them too. So it's worth a shot. And I took it and I found about probably close to 50% of mine would participate in a few skills. I try to keep it small and not huge expectations, but small things. The other thing that I think about for the end of the school year is, what can I do now that will make my back to school easier? This tends to be a season of, I have some random downtime, or I have some random times to where my student, their homeroom class is outside for field day and my student is able to go. And so now I'm not going to teach that lesson with them. But now I have spare time. So what can I do now at the end of this school year that will make my back to school easier? So some thoughts for that. I'd like to take this time, like this last month of school, and I think maybe you're not quite at a month, but you're close to that. I try to take this time and think about, process out this year. What worked really well this year? What parts of my day and what parts of my schedule worked really well? And what didn't work this year? What are things that I really need to work on? Maybe I found with the last years that I taught, I found that we started doing a morning calendar, but we waited until 10 o'clock to do our morning calendar because our morning meeting involved a lot. We did some dancing and we did a lot of movement. And so about 10 o'clock was the point to where my students were wiggly and they were getting close to lunchtime and they needed that break. So the previous year, I had been doing calendar at 8:30, like right after breakfast. And then our morning kind of drug on. And so I did this kind of end of the year assessment and I was like, well, what didn't work this year? Well, 8:30 calendar didn't work. So the next year I moved calendar to 10 o'clock because calendar gave us kind of that needed movement break and it rolled us towards lunch. And it broke up our day much better for both me and for my students. I think about things like what schedules. I think about my schedules for my classroom assistants and my personal schedule. What worked really well, what didn't work, what things flow and what didn't flow. And then I think about, so I always deal with behavior. So the other thing that I think about is what part of my day had the most behavior issues. Maybe because this is good information, right? If there's the specific parts of my day that have a lot of behavior issues, then this tells me something. I need to make changes during that part of the day for the next school year. If I don't have time to make them now, I definitely need to rethink those parts of the day. Or maybe I need to think about which of my students had the most behavior issues this year, which of my students needed the most significant behavior supports. And then I am thinking about them next year. What else could I put into place for them? Do they need more visual supports? Do they need a behavior intervention plan? What can I put into place for them that will help us be more successful next year so we don't have so many behavior challenges? So I kind of think through some of those kinds of things. And I know this sounds, I don't know, when I first started doing this, I thought, well, this sounds kind of silly, but it was a way for me to reflect on what worked really well. What do I want to keep next year? What parts of my schedule do I definitely want to make sure that happen and what part don't? One year I put into place a reinforcement system that involved me giving out pennies. Every kid had a cup and I was giving out all these pennies. And that reinforcement system was huge. And I was so excited and I really thought it was going to be this great thing, but it was so much work and it made me miserable. It made me miserable. And I don't think it was super effective for my students. So I decided at the end of the year, I was like, we're not going to continue this. This is not working for me. This is not working necessarily for my students. And I had tried changing it multiple times throughout the year. And I'd done all kinds of things to make it work because I'd invested so much time into that reinforcement system. And I really thought it was going to be this great thing, but it turned out not to be. So I really had to make some changes. So reflect on what has worked really well and what hasn't worked really well. And the other thing that I think about is my incoming students. If I'm going to be having new students next year, how can I work them into our schedule? What will their day look like? Sometimes I'm getting new assistants into my classroom. And so I'm thinking through all of these things for them. What parts of my schedule worked really well and what parts did not? And what changes can I make that will make it be more positive and more efficient for me and for my students? So other things that you can do at the end of the year, definitely think about sorting out your classroom materials. I always try to do a reflection of, so I will tell you, I am a teacher. I am a hoarder. I had the hardest time getting rid of things. It's something I don't know if it came from. I taught a few years in districts that were you did not get funding for classroom materials. So I was a number one dumpster diver. So I come from that. That's my teaching background. I'm a dumpster diver. And so I had a really hard time of letting things go. And I still have a hard time of letting things go probably. So getting rid of things. So sorting out my classroom materials, updating my classroom materials. A lot of times I did in my classrooms, I did structured teaching. And so we did a lot of shoebox task work and a lot of file folder work. So I needed to see we kept a bin, just a little basket of folders that were missing parts or were damaged. And I needed to decide, am I going to repair these or am I going to toss these? But I kind of use this time of the year. And this is a great thing for your classroom assistants to do. And I will tell you, in some of the settings that I have worked in, my older students, this was a vocational task, right? Repairing these damaged materials. I got my students to help me out, repairing some of these materials and sorting through all of the pieces that are just random pieces. Okay, which folders do these go with? How can we get these back together? So it gave my students, especially my middle and high school age students, it gave them some good job possibility skills of how do you sort things? How do we repair this damaged file folder? What can we do with these? So I have done that definitely during this season of the school year. I'm also thinking about new materials needed for next year. Our school, I don't know if your schools do this, but there was a limit on the copies that you could make. Every year there was always a limit. So I checked to see how many copies I had left. And then I thought about, okay, what material can I go ahead and print out some schedule cards? Can I go ahead and start printing some of the material for next year that will help me get off on a better start? I started copying things. So just thinking about, I know things that I knew I was going to need. So I knew I was going to need a welcome or introduction letter. I knew I was going to need my data collection sheets for my students who were returning, and if their IEP wasn't going to change right away. So I went ahead and put together things like my data collection sheets, visual schedules, PECs or communication pictures. That's something that you can never probably have enough of those kinds of things. Reinforcer inventories or reinforcer surveys. So at the beginning of the school year with all of my students, I would do something called a reinforcer survey or a reinforcer, like an inventory of, hey, what things are you liking right now? It's just a list of things that I can kind of go through and say, yeah, he likes this, or no, he doesn't. And it helps me pull items that could be used to motivate the student to work. Because if I can do it now during this end of the year time when things are kind of, the schedule's up in the air and things are all crazy, but now I've got some weird random downtime, then this is great. Also for my classroom assistants, my assistants, I guess it was like the bonus when you got to take the basket to the workroom, to the staff workroom and make copies or laminate stuff. They were like, oh my gosh, I'm taking the basket and I'll be back. And so it was motivating for them to kind of get out of the classroom and go down and hang out in the workroom and laminate or make those copies. So it's a good use of their time too, if their schedules are changing and they don't have to be with a specific student during that time. So instead of just having people kind of sitting around in the classroom, hanging out, and now you've got, not only do you have extra students hanging around in your classroom, now you've got extra adults that are just kind of there. Maybe their student is absent, or maybe they're involved in an activity that they don't need that one-to-one assistant. Well, now you can take advantage of that because you have a basket of materials that needs prepared for next year. So updating, making copies, repairing damaged materials, even just prepping schedule cards is huge, huge. The other thing that you can think about, especially for your students, is keeping a basket of materials or an extra set of lesson plans for sudden changes in the schedule. So these are things that you can put together really quickly for unexpected end of the year schedule changes. I try to keep some, and these tended to be fun, but still involve learning. So I'll give you an example. At the end of the school year, we traveled, we called it, we went around the world. We didn't call it around the world in 180 days, but we went around the world in 27 days. So on the days of the weeks that I knew that we were going to have, I was going to end up with a lot of my students in the classroom, or the schedule was going to be highly shifted and changed, or my kids were going to be in my classroom the whole day instead of being able to go in and out like they would normally. They're going to be with me all day. We traveled around the world. And so here's how we traveled around the world. This was our fun activity. They were really easy, low prep. I picked different countries. One year we did Africa. We traveled to Africa. And I think we did pick specific countries within Africa, but we traveled to the continent of Africa. And by traveling, I pulled up on my smartboard some images that I had previously looked at, right? So I'm making sure that all of these are safe, and any items that I'm pulling up, I've pre-checked without students watching, just in case, right? Before I show them. But I pulled up images of here's where you would find Africa on a map. Here is some animals that you might find. And I would have my kids, all right, guys, what do you want to know about Africa? Well, I don't know. And so they would come up with different things. The big piece that everybody loved was we ate something. Whatever country we traveled to, we ate a food item from that country. And we did things like, they didn't always love this, but we did things like we colored Africa on a map. We cut out pictures. So we did kind of a writing activity. And for some of my students, they would write things I learned. These are the 3 things I learned about Africa, and they could write that down. For my students that did not have handwriting skills, then we would have a selection of pictures they could choose from. And so they would choose 3 pictures of things that they learned about Africa, and we would glue them on a page. And an adult is writing 3 things I learned about Africa, and they could glue those pictures on the page, and that was their writing piece of it. But the food activity was the big hit, because I'm a teacher and I love to eat, and the adults in my classroom all love to eat, and all my kids love to eat. So when we traveled to Africa, and I can't remember which country it was, we did blood orange slushies, because sometimes I tried to pick foods that I knew my kids would eat. And we tried a couple of other fruits from there. I can't remember at this point. I think we might've ate, I don't remember what all we ate at that point, but I do remember the blood orange slushies. We bought blood oranges at Kroger, and so we squeezed oranges. So in a blender, so my kids are helping me squeeze oranges. So we're getting some gross motor activity, right? We're squeezing oranges. We've done a writing activity. We've investigated Africa on a map. And now we're making slushies, which is kind of the reinforcement piece of this. And it was something different. We didn't necessarily do geography in my classroom every day, right? So it gave us a schedule, right? All of these activities became a part of that schedule that day. And it gave the kids and the adults something to look forward to. And the slushies turned out pretty darn good. We just squeezed oranges and mixed it with a little bit of 7-Up and a whole lot of crushed ice. And the kids were ecstatic. We also did things like we traveled to Mexico, and in Mexico, we learned about the state flag, or we learned about the country's flag. We learned about what oceans, what other countries, Mexico touches America, what other countries are around them. We learned about a few different aspects of some of the culture of Mexico. And then we ate some of the foods from Mexico, right? So we did things like that. That was the biggest hit with my kids, because we could pair it with eating. Pretty much anything that I could do that paired it with eating was a pretty big reinforcer for everybody. And it kept us from sitting in a classroom all day. I didn't have students that would just watch TV. I don't know if you all have that, but a lot of times they're like, oh, just watch some movies. Well, my kids didn't watch movies. And I had a few students who might watch movies, but for the most part, my students they didn't really watch movies, at least not all together in that context. They would, of course, at this point, they'd probably watch YouTube videos all day long, but that wasn't a good plan for us. It was going to cause more behavior problems by having a day to where kids are kind of asked to entertain themselves. So I kept kind of a basket of different activities. I did things like, and I want you guys to think while I'm talking, think about it. What do you have any suggestions for this, a quick activity that you could put together at the end of the year? Now, the food items we had to plan for. I knew these things were going to happen. And so I kind of had to bring in all of these things to make the food happen. So it wasn't necessarily this quick set of plans, but it was something that I did. The easier things that I did was we did Lego challenges. I had a lot of students who were highly interested in Legos. And so we did Lego challenges. And by challenge, I would say, all right, guys, let's build an animal. Show me your animal. And so I let them play with the Legos, but part of the time, at least, I kind of gave them some direction. All right, guys, let's build a vehicle let's build an automobile, something that has wheels. Some pretty specific things like that. The other things that I did that worked out really well, we did turn-taking games. We did turn-taking games because turn-taking was a very hard skill. And all of my students were we had some social skill goal that we were working on. And so we would pull out board games or card games and work on turn taking. So kids were getting to do something that was fun and a little bit different than what we would normally do on a regular basis. But I was still able to provide structure and to keep them motivated and using it as the day went on. And we might not do board games all day, right? We're not doing that a whole day, but just for a little while. We've done some fun things like field days. My students couldn't tolerate necessarily being outside a whole day, but I have seen some really good ideas, and I will share some links with you. These three, the Autism Helper, which I love, her end of the year activities, she has a really good suggestion. You have to go there and look at her suggestion for field. I think it's her that has the field day activities. She had a schedule that she shared that is for about an hour-long field day, or maybe a 2-hour field day of here are some activities that you could set up. And instead of just saying, hey, we're going outside and it's field day and kids, you have to entertain yourself. That doesn't necessarily work very well for a lot of our students with autism or with low incidence. But what she did say was she set up stations. And so the kids rotated through 4 or 5 stations. And so they spent 10 or 15 minutes at each station. That way they didn't have enough time to get bored, hopefully. And then they were able to go back in and go on with their day. So just a couple of really good articles that I found really helpful over the past few years. And I haven't seen the Autism Helper put anything terrible out yet. And this you ought to know is just end of the year tips for organization. Just thinking about how can I get organized? Going back to those thoughts of what worked really well, what didn't work really well. I will tell you, my worst end of the year was probably my first year. And I did not, our school building, we had to pack up our room. And I was not prepared for that. I had never experienced that. And you guys probably have to do that as well, right? It's the end of the year and they're like, all right, you got to pack all of your stuff up because we're going to haul it out into the hallway and wax your floor. Well, I packed up too early. I started packing things up like that last month of school, things I thought I wouldn't need. And then I needed them because I still had kids, and it led to a lot of confusion. So don't pack up too early. If I had anything to add, it would be that, because it'll help you keep those routines in.
Thank you, Ms. Kim, for presenting today. And thanks everyone for being here. Have a great evening, and we'll see you next time.